Hey, I'm Charles and I'm here with Scott and we are on the Bible Breakdown, a podcast where we're digging into what the Bible is, how we approach it, and what we can learn from it. Scott, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do here at Willow.
Yeah. My name is Scott Woods. I'm a campus pastor at our South Lake location, so I get to hang out with some of the cool people out in the Lincolnshire area. I've been at Willow now for about 18 years, so kind of been around, and it feels like ages, but I love being part of this community. How about you?
So my name is Charles Perry, and I currently serve as the pastor of ceremonies and visitation, which I love to put that I get to sit with people in the highs and lows, whether that's walking with families through the seasons of grief of having to plan a funeral ceremony, or I get to sit with the excited couples who are on a journey towards the altar to have a God-centered, lifelong, love-filled marriage.
Love it.
So I get to do a little bit of both. Yeah.
Important ministry.
Thank you.
Dude.
Yep. All right, it's episode 1, and today we're going to start with the question, what is the Bible? So, Scott, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's going to be fun, Charles.
Yeah, it is. I'm really looking forward to it. Been looking forward to this for some time, and one of the questions that I think everybody first wrestles with when they hear about the Bible is like, what is it? What is the Bible? And just real quick, what's a brief summary? What's the one sentence answer you've got for what the Bible is?
Yeah, I don't know if I can do it in one sentence particularly, but
okay.
I think it's a valid question. And I think it's a question that all believers have wrestled with at some point. Mm-hmm. And then even those that are just investigating faith and have been curious about it. So this is really important. So let's zoom out just a little bit. Okay. The Bible is not a book. It is actually a collection of books. Yep. 66 in total. In our Bible, we have 66 books that are written by many different authors over centuries. So it's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot. And within it, you also have different writing styles or literary styles, as we'll often refer to them as. So we have books that are written as just history books. They're passing down information. What is it that took place? What can we learn from those things? We've got books of poetry. We have books of wisdom. We have prophetic books. We have letters that were written to churches. We have accounts written about the life of Jesus. There's all sorts of things that all culminate in this thing that we call the Bible.
Yeah, it is super diverse, which is probably one of the things that I appreciated about it the most is that there is no one genre. Yeah. There is no speaking voice that's the same throughout it, where it doesn't have this monotone feel to it, but it is extremely dynamic. And I think that's really important. I really think it's really important, that the authors and author of the Bible aren't this boring individual that is at one place in time trying to recall all of history and all of the future at one point to write it across.
So let's go back just real quick because you just gave us a glimpse of something that I think we need to zero in on.
Do it.
You just said authors and author. So you gave it a plural, but then you also gave it a singular. Yes. Tell me more about why.
So we believe, right, that the Bible, is written with the creativity and the language of various authors over time. And so that's the reason why I say plural, just as you said, right? There were multiple authors that wrote various books of the Bible. And then at the same time, it's the singular story where we see clearly that there is one author telling his story of his interaction in human history for his purposes and redemption. And so God is also an author of the Bible that kind of oversees all of this writing as it takes place.
So we would say written down by humankind,
yes,
but inspired and guided, yes, and also protected, which we can talk about at some point, by God.
Yes, absolutely.
That's incredible.
And I think that is actually very important for us to recognize and grapple with the fact that God oversaw the process. And so because of that, it's trustworthy. Because of that, I know that there's somebody that cares about the integrity and the truthfulness of it, that cares about preserving it, and is also making sure that these stories across multiple authors, multiple locations, we didn't even talk about geography yet, or languages, right? You have all of these things that are just so different from one another that it does really take somebody that transcends all of those variables to tie them together.
Yeah. So let's talk about those languages just real quick.
Okay.
Because the Bible was not originally written in English.
No.
It was translated for us, right?
Yes.
And so let's talk about some of those original languages, just so we have an understanding where we're coming from.
Yes. So the three languages that the Bible is originally written in and throughout in various sections are going to be Hebrew,
Yeah.
Greek, and Aramaic.
Yeah.
And so all three of those languages even have a different philosophy or approach to the way that they communicate. And so if you think of Greek and you think of the time and the context and the cultural context of Rome and these Greek empires and the development of that language, it's very practical, articulate, to the point, and yet Hebrew is so vastly different. One of the things that continues to break my mind when I was reading and learning and studying Hebrew is that they don't have vowels. Like there are entire letters that are missing, even though they know how to pronounce it. And so to really unify and then say, okay, not only are we going to have Hebrew, not only are we going to have Greek, but we're also going to have Aramaic, because there's also these people groups as this story moves through history, moves through locations, moves through the rising and falling of kingdoms. And so now nobody's speaking Hebrew. That's no longer the official language of the context of some of these
primary, right?
Correct.
Yeah, as the centuries have moved on. And so then that brings us to like, how do we get this into English, right? And these Bibles that we have today in its various forms of translation and where we get those things from.
You know, somebody said it great this way. If you were to try and go and read even an old English newspaper, just the amount that would be confusing to you because words change and evolve over time. So first we have this collection across various languages that now then needs to get translated into a language that we can understand, right? The Enlightenment happens. People are learning to read. You no longer need to go and show up and have it read for yourself, but the desire in the people of God at that time thought, you know what, it's important. This message, this book, this Bible is so important that everybody should have access and be able to read it. Well, that means that it needs to be in a language that everybody can read.
And we saw that especially take place during the Reformation with Martin Luther and him wanting to make the Bible accessible. And through the power of the printing press, then it just really just blows up through that.
It blows up. The Latin Vulgate. So the very first language, well, the primary language that we now begin to derive from is Latin. So when we start to see the early translation processes, we get it translating into Latin, to then which we get more translations come on down the line. Right. And the value behind translation is to go, what are some of the oldest copies that we have of the original text? Now, I believe that God has inspired and oversaw the process and preservation of his scripture. And yet, I can be honest and say that we don't have the original actual manuscripts that were originally written. This is because, well, we make copies. There's lots of copies and copies of copies of copies. But even the process of making these copies were so painstakingly accurate that if a mistake was made, the entire process started over.
Right. It was meticulous. To say it easily. I had an experience a few years ago. I was in Germany teaching at a high school camp. My German is not good enough to teach and preach in German, so I had a translator up there with me. And this just really highlighted to me how important translation is because while I was on the trip, the translator that would translate my messages would also just translate like the daily activities. Like we went to a restaurant, he would help me with that and those sorts of things. And as we were having conversations with those that were in German, he would say something to me and then look back to them speak in German and then just kind of look at me and go, yeah, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, wait a second. What, you can't just blah, 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 whatever it is that person just said, because that might be significant. And then I started to worry, are you just looking at the congregation or the high school students at that time and just going like, oh, you know what he means. And I'm like, no, you can't do that with translation. But translation is incredibly hard, actually, because you have to take something that was meant in a place and time and move it to a new place and a new time and have it be understandable, right?
Yep. So let me ask this question along that train of thought. The process of translation. and kind of what are the methods, or how did people go about translating this into another language? Because I know in some languages our sentence structure is the same, but then there are some languages that the sentence structure is not the same.
It's not the same at all, right? And so the translation process is a meticulous, to go back to that word, process that is painstaking and takes years. I mean, it's never, I won't say never, it's usually in the best publishing houses that are doing it, it's not one person that's coming up with what the translation is. It's coming up with the ideas are coming out of the community and how it is to best take what they have in the most original transcripts that we have and then put them into understandable words for today. But even with that, we have a spectrum.
Yeah, because
So
there's
there's
lots
a
of Bibles out
translation spectrum, right? Like if you go to any store, you go onto Amazon or whatever, and you just type in Bible and you're just trying to find a new Bible, you're going to start seeing things that maybe you don't understand. So let's just give a little framework for that, because that all really stems from translation and how things are being translated. So on one side of the translation spectrum, you have like a word for word. This word means this word. And they put that together. Oftentimes, those sentences are harder to read because you're coming from a Hebrew, you're coming from a Greek, where their sentence structure is very different than ours. I'm doing Duolingo right now with Spanish, and I'm always getting my adverbs and adjectives in the wrong spots, right? Because the English language does all that differently. And so I'm having to learn how to like switch those when I'm switching languages in my mind, which I'm absolutely terrible at. Okay, but you have a word for word kind of side of the spectrum. And there are some people out there that just swear by that and say that is the only way to go. But then also I've seen that become a barrier for people because they'll sit down and read it and go, this makes no sense.
Can you give an example of a translation somebody might find that would fit into the word for word category?
Something that would be further on that side would be your New American Standard Bible.
Okay.
So the NASB would be the letters that you would see associated with that. A little bit more difficult to read. It is English. You know what those words are, but you don't always know. Your brain doesn't know always how to put that into a conversation, or it's not how you would speak anyway. ESV is a little bit further onto that side as well. That's the English Standard Version. Then the far end of the spectrum, you have really just paraphrase.
Okay.
We're just going to like get like the best idea and we're going to make it super readable for you. I've seen that be a great entryway for some people where they want to start reading the Bible, but they struggle with the word for word. And so they come in on the paraphrase side going like, oh, I can understand this and understand the concepts that are brought up. Now, the problem with that side is it's a hard study, or it's a hard way to study the Bible. If you want to go into like original, like this word means this, you're not going to find that in a paraphrase. And so you're going to see like the Message Bible far onto the paraphrase side. It's just kind of like summing it up, telling you the story, but readability is a high value for a paraphrase. But then you have like right in the middle of that spectrum, which would be a thought for thought. And so it's kind of a blend or a hybrid of the two, of the word for word and paraphrase. We're going to give you a thought for thought. We're going to work really hard to stay towards the original meaning and those original words as best as we can, but we got to make it understandable.
So we have that, there are multiple authors, both human, that where God honored their unique time and space and culture and language. And yet at the same time, he's involved in this process and oversees all of it. And so throughout these 66 books, throughout that process, get preserved to become what we know as the Bible. And then from there, it's written in 3 languages that end up getting translated, really starting at the Reformation and the boom of the printing press, to begin to translate the Bible to make it accessible to lots of people. And that work continues today. It is one of the things that amazes me is how many languages or people groups that still do not have a Bible in their formal natural language, their native tongue. And yet how many people do now because of that. And I think that's a phenomenal work. And then, but even in that translating into a language, you talked about how there's a spectrum between being word for word or thought for thought. And that at Willow, we really desire to land in the middle there with the New International Version because we believe it's the most accurate to the original languages in the text and yet is the most readable in a thought-for-thought natural language speaking pattern.
Of the versions that exist now.
Of the versions that exist now. Which
absolutely.
I will add, language changes over time.
It does.
And so the current version of the NIV isn't the only version of the NIV.
That's true. Yeah.
And so it is always important that generations from now, they'll need another English Bible because language changes. And every generation, every group of people, I think, deserves and should have the Bible in a way that's easy to read for them because I don't keep up with my slang like I used to. All right, Scott, we talked about how varied and how much information there is, all the processes that went into it from like this human perspective of this process. But still, how can we trust it? Like we talked about there being a divine author that's there, but we're not saying that he wrote it. So how do we know that he took care of it?
Yeah. So one of the amazing things that we have seen in the Bible is how it's been maintained and preserved over time. So it wasn't until, I believe, the 1950s, and somebody can Google it and check out my timestamp on that, but it was pretty modern history where there were some scrolls that were discovered in a cave. And when they opened those up, it turned out to be the earliest transcripts that we have of the Bible that had just been found. And when they compared those earliest transcripts to what we have now, they found that they were over 99% accurate. And in the places where it was, let's say, not accurate, it was really just in some minor punctuation that did not change the meaning. And so one of the things we can actually do as a Christ follower and somebody who has faith is be able to look back and go, man, God's really preserved this over time. Even with the fallibility of the person writing it originally, even though they were inspired by God, that person was fallible, but God still made his word infallible and then protected it over centuries. And that's, honestly, that's kind of mind-blowing because you don't see that happen. You don't see that happen. We have other manuscripts for other writings in the world where we haven't even seen it over a shorter amount of time. Things like the Iliad, where people look back and go, this is an historical book. It's an historical document. And yet when they look back at some of the earliest manuscripts, they see over time that things have changed. And so one of the most beautiful things about Scripture and some of the transcripts that we have now is we get to go, man, our God was so good and cares so much about his word that he's going to protect it for us. Even through our ability to mess things up, he has still protected that and kept it his word for us.
I love that. I love that God has protected it, that he's kept it, that it is more historically accurate and we have more copies and older copies. There's some other texts that we don't question about at all that we receive and learn in academia. I also love, and maybe you can speak to this just a little bit, is that archaeology actually plays a role. Like we do live in a day and age where we can go to some sites and dig some things up.
Yeah.
And you talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls and those findings. And so would you say that our archaeology, or as we uncover history, validates that or has come into contradiction with that? Or how does that play into it now?
Yeah, I'm a terrible archaeologist, right? Because archaeologists use like paintbrushes to remove the soil, and I'm like, get me the biggest tractor possible, and I'm just going to move the earth as quick as possible. So I'd make a terrible archaeologist. But I will say that there have been questions that have arisen over time of when we see something in the Bible, we'll go, there's actually no evidence that that thing existed. And there have been times where suddenly something is uncovered, and it just opens up a whole new way for us to see that that was a reality, that is what took place, or this geographic location did take place. But the Pool of Bethesda is mentioned in Scripture. Archaeologists for a long time have said that pool actually doesn't exist. Well, it was sometime last year, they were digging in an area, and suddenly they find this pool and trying to figure out like, what was this for? Where did it come from? How old is it? And suddenly things are starting to match up, that what is called the Pool of Bethesda in the New Testament, in the Gospels, where Jesus was and healed some people, actually did exist.
You know, I love just how other disciplines come to bear as it intends to investigate the reliability of Scripture. That we're not the first ones to have this question to say, hey, is the Bible trustworthy? But that there are actually people and entire groups over various places and times that have asked the same question and use various methods to investigate. And yet it still stands, having withstood the test of academic and different disciplines, really investigating that. And so I think it's great. It was at one point in my walk, that was the thing that I fell down the rabbit hole on was, is there any substantial evidence that counters or refutes the stories in Scripture? And there isn't, which I'm just blown away by.
Yeah,
Awesome.
It's pretty amazing.
So we talk a lot about questions and the questions we've had, the questions that history has had when we're talking about what the Bible is. But let's say I believe you for a moment. What do I do when I go to read it? Like, does it matter how I approach Scripture if what it says is true?
Yeah, it absolutely does. Like 100%. How you enter in and how I can even enter in a daily way because it's not just a once decision. It's like an every time I open up the book, it absolutely matters. So let's talk about that in the next episode.
Sounds like a plan.